All right, we might get started. Thank you, everyone, for joining us over your lunch breaks. Feel free to keep your cameras off and munch away if this is your time to do your lunch break in what I'm sure is a busy day for everyone. Thank you everyone for joining this webinar. I'd just like to mention as we get started that the webinar itself will be recorded, but of course the Q&A session afterwards will not. So we really encourage people to engage meaningfully in any questions that we might have. This is what the purpose of this webinar is about, but the information from our experts today will be recorded and then uploaded onto our website. So to begin, I would like to acknowledge that I'm on Ngunnawal country here in Canberra. I would like to pay my respects to elders, past, present, and emerging, and extend that respect to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander peoples that may be with us on the call, but also really recognising the many First Nations people that are working on country every day to care for it. This includes our Indigenous rangers, the rangers that are working across our 10 deserts, the leadership and custodianship of First Nations people, looking after our Great Barrier Reef and other areas of national significance, and many, many more. There is no meaningful conversation on sustainability, including sustainable finance, that doesn't properly recognise and understand the views, the perspectives, and elevating those perspectives, the perspectives of the people that have cared for country continuously in an unbroken way for over 65,000 years. So as part of everything that we do at ASFI, we would like to recognise the responsibility to work together with First Nations people to inform our work to improve economic and social self-determination outcomes for First Nations people. So it's really great to see you guys dialing on today. We're talking about the Environmental Protection Biodiversity Conservation Act. It's the first and only time I will say it at length, otherwise known as the EPBC Act. And it's great to see engagement today on this issue because, we really do recognise that this is not something that at least financial institutions would ordinarily be focused on as a primary consideration as part of their engagement. But of course, things have shifted significantly, particularly in the last 5 years, as we all start to grapple with the materiality of the way in which we do business, the way in which our economy runs, and within the planetary boundaries that we have, and the impacts, the dependencies, and the opportunities that comes out of that. So the EPBC Act reform is a very important and significant reform in Australia. It is a once-in-a-generation opportunity for Australia to have a look at its environmental laws. I would say about the EPBC Act, and our expert guests are going to talk a lot more about it now. It was put into effect in 1999, so it is an old piece of legislation. And it is not actually an Environmental Protection Act. It is an environmental assessment process for new economic developments where those developments interact with areas of national environmental significance. And so what it aims to do is put in place the guardrails or the processes around which that activity can take place, right? What we know over the last 20 or so years, or 25 years, 26 years since the Act was enacted, is that it is not working. So Australia's environment has continued to deteriorate dramatically. The last State of the Environment report shows, pockets of dire ecological, our ecology is actually not doing well at all. There are ailing systems, and we're on the brink of, a wave of mass extinctions if we don't really start to turn things around. And so something has to change. And this is why really focusing on this act is the baseline regulation together with, I guess, the state laws, and we'll talk a little bit about how those things fit together, is really important. It's important for FIs because as we know, FIs have come a long way in terms of really understanding nature risk and starting to think about that from both an impact and dependency point of view, but also an opportunity point of view. And what this does is if we have strong baseline regulation, it sets the rules of the game and enables companies to be able to start to internalize those risks and those costs, and it creates an equal playing field for businesses to actually take positive action to invest in opportunities. Absent a strong baseline, that progress will be limited at best, and you will continue to have a patchwork of activities that are happening to try and fill the gaps. And this is why we thought it's really important to start engaging with our members on this issue, because this is something that is obviously on the agenda for financial institutions. So we're going to hear from 4 experts in the field from different perspectives. I would say we had Rachel Wallamsey also agreeing to join us today. She is the head of policy and law reform at the Environmental Defender's Office. Unfortunately, she has been pulled away to an urgent court action today, and so is not able to join us. So Brendan Sides has volunteered to also talk to her slides. So you'll see Rachel's slides at the beginning, which Brendan is very kindly spoken to, and then of course he will also deal with the areas that he's discussed. So I would introduce Brendan. He's the National Biodiversity Policy Advisor at the Australian Conservation Foundation, and he's really going to give us an overview of the legal framework, but also the why we should be caring about this. And then we have Alex and Emily from EY's Climate Change and Sustainability Services team. They are, both experts working in the nature space and really going to be talking about it from the perspective of some of EY's clients and businesses and how they've been interacting with this process. And then, of course, we also have Dr. Megan Evans. She's a senior lecturer of public sector management at UNSW Canberra. Megan has got an excellent track record dealing with offsets, markets. She's worked for the Queensland Land Restoration Fund, I think in its initial stages, and will give a really good perspective, both from an understanding more of how offsets fit into the system, but also some of what that means from a risk perspective to financial institutions. So without further ado, I will hand over to Brendan to get us started. And thank you very much, Brendan, for channeling Rachel as well.
Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity to talk to you all today. Are you able to share Rachel's slides? Is that possible?
No problem. Angelica's going to get that up.
I'm not Rachel, and I wouldn't pretend to be able to present as clearly as she would have in introducing the topic here, but I'll give it my best shot. So if we could move to the first slide. Rachel is really just going to set the scene and provide a little bit of background to the review that's led to the proposed reforms to the EPBC Act, and I guess provide some context for the discussion that follows. As we've already heard in the introduction, we have national environmental laws, the EPBC Act, which are now 20 plus years old. It's widely agreed that they're broken and not working. We environmentalists have been saying that for some time, but business has been pretty clear about that as well. Government has clearly acknowledged that it came through very strongly in the Assembly review of the EPBC Act a couple of years ago. So there's a clear need, I guess, to act, and an opportunity as well, in the sense that the current government and the Minister Tanya Plibersek have committed to overhauling the national laws. She released the Nature Positive Plan in December 2022, which is a comprehensive response to the Samuel Review. And we're now in a somewhat complicated way, which I'll get to sort of partway through a process of working on drafts and developing drafts before they're introduced into Parliament, hopefully this year sometime. As Rachel has outlined in the slide, there's kind of we're really thinking of this as a once-in-a-generation opportunity. Reforming any laws, particularly environmental laws, is always difficult and controversial. This is a big job. The kind of stars are aligned, I guess, in terms of the review, the release of the State of the Environment report by the government in 2021, and the sort of dire environmental data that was presented there, and the platform that creates for the reforms, and also the fact that we've got a senior minister in the government who has very publicly committed to some significant changes to the current framework. So the ultimate outcome, I guess, is I hope that we'll get much stronger environmental laws, including ones that deal with some very significant blind spots in the legislation at the moment with respect to things like climate. Next slide, please. So I won't dwell on this. We can come back to questions, I guess, in questions about and further discussion about the current problems with the current legislation. But the absence of climate change I've already mentioned. The fact that really, and I'll come to this in my concluding slides as well, the Act does very little to actually protect anything. It's in the title, but that's about as far as it goes. It's a very discretionary framework, very process-oriented, and very much beholden to a kind of an early view as to how you actually design an environmental regulatory system, in the sense that it's very much centred on the Minister of the day, and history has shown very much dependent upon the approach that the Minister of the day takes to implementing the legislation as well. And as I've already mentioned, there's general consensus that it doesn't work for business, it doesn't work for the environment, it doesn't work for community, it doesn't work for Australians, First Nations people. So a clear need for reform. The next slide. So Professor Graham Samuel is, I guess, an expert in regulation, but an outsider to environmental regulation. He was commissioned by the previous government to do the 10-yearly review of the EPBC Act. There's a requirement within the legislation to conduct reviews at 10-yearly intervals. His second of the 10-yearly reviews followed one after the first 10 years of the legislation by Alan Hawke, comprehensive set of recommendations there, which basically went nowhere. So salutary lesson in terms of where we're at now and getting the recommendations from the Samuel Review implemented. His findings were pretty damning. You can just imagine, I guess, someone picking up the legislation and having a look at how it's been implemented and saying, you don't seem to actually clear about what you're wanting to achieve with this legislation. It's very much tied up in a lot of processes and busy work without any real clarity around how it's supposed to be delivering its objectives of ecologically sustainable development. There was a very strong foundational finding in his review, and important to some of the key recommendations, which we'll come to through the discussion as well. The next slide, please. I point out, just in terms of the timeliness and the opportunity, which is the subject of this slide, that I think in October this year, we'll get to a point where we're 5 years from the date that the Samuel Review commenced. So we're almost halfway through the kind of 10-year period between reviews. You know, for a whole range of reasons, I think it's really urgent that we get cracking and get these laws into Parliament and get some good, strong laws passed. But the fact that you know, we've been dithering on the recommendations from the review, which concluded a few years ago now, for some time, I think, it really emphasises the urgency of getting moving. Some of the recommendations from the review, which have been picked up by the government in this Nature Positive Plan, which, as I said, was released in December 2022, things like firstly, the key recommendation from the Samuel Review, this emphasis on national environmental standards, legally binding standards that set out with clarity the outcomes that are intended to be achieved by the legislation. Not a recommendation from the Samuel Review, but one that the government has embraced, that is a National Environment Protection Agency or authority to both make decisions but also be responsible for compliance and enforcement under the legislation. And I'll come back to that in my slides later in the discussion as well. Some clarity around things that just can't be approved, these upfront unacceptable impacts, which I'll talk a bit about as well. A lot of recommendations around biodiversity offsetting, which no doubt Megan will talk to. There's a commitment in the Nature Positive Plan to the nature repair market, which, as people will know, was subject of legislation which was passed late last year. A whole range of other things as well. As was said in the opening remarks, the legislation and most of the attention on the legislation focuses on the development and impact assessment regime and how that protects or doesn't protect these so-called matters of national environmental significance. But there's some other very important parts of the legislation as well that deal with things like conservation planning and listing of threatened species and recovery strategies for threatened species and so forth. So all of those things are up for discussion and review as well. There's some commitments to move beyond what Professor Samuel called the tokenistic engagement of First Nations communities in decision-making under the legislation. Some other really important commitments to the environment movement, especially around bringing the current regional forest agreements regime in under the legislation and removing the current exemption for RFA. Very little in terms of commitments in relation to climate change in the Nature Positive Plan, and there's a kind of a continuing theme with the Minister for Environment saying it's the Minister for Climate's job, and we've done everything we're proposing to do through things like the safeguard mechanism and so forth. Professor Samuel did recommend some very limited disclosure requirements in relation to Scope 1 and 2 emissions without any real clarity about what's done with that information through the system. But this is going to be a subject of ongoing discussion. There's a little bit of movement happening already with the government recognising, I guess, that they can't reproduce the current sort of climate blindedness of the current EPBC Act in the new legislation. So definitely an issue to watch. The next slide. So the commitment in the Nature Positive Plan was that we'd actually have draft legislation into Parliament by late last year, and that we'd be consulting on draft laws, exposure drafts of the package sometime around the middle of last year. That hasn't happened. And we're still actually partway through a modified process now where rather than releasing a whole package of draft legislation, the government is consulting with elected experts from the environment and business community on drafts of the laws over a sort of a staged process. So we're just had the third of those consultations the week before last, and we've got the fourth of them scheduled for the end of March. There's no clear commitment from the government as to when they're going to get the bills into Parliament. They've been quite cagey on that. The kind of greatest clarity they've provided is they're committed to get it into Parliament as early as possible in 2024. It's basically a bit of a talk to the hand response, I think, in terms of our demands for clarity around what the actual time frame is that they're proposing for the introduction of legislation. So it's speculation, I guess, that, as to when they'll get into Parliament, let alone how long it will take for them to pass through Parliament. So there'll undoubtedly be considerable amendments required to get them to a point that we're satisfied with, but also critically others in the Parliament who would be supportive of the nature law reform, but wanting to see some important changes, Greens and other crossbenchers, for legislation to a point where they're happy to support it. So there's a long way to go, and the distinct possibility of an election intervening somewhere in the middle of it all as well. People will know. The next slide. In conclusion, is a nice crisp hope or aspiration from Rachel, I guess, that what we're really aiming for here is new, clear national environmental laws and standards that actually protect the environment, protect natural capital, deliver the outcomes for climate, nature, community, and business. I'll come back to some of the key elements of what we see as important as part of the package and where some of the things are maybe falling a bit short in my concluding remarks. But I think that's the last of Rachel's slides, so I can sort of leave that there for now and hand over to the next presenter. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Brendan. We might hand over now to Emily and Alex to talk about it from the perspective of business. Well, they are so efficient with loading their slides. We do have a Q&A function, so if you do have questions so long, please put them in the Q&A chat as we go along, and then there'll be plenty of time for Q&A after that. So I encourage you to do that while the presenters are presenting. But over to you guys. Thanks.
Awesome. Thank you, Nicole, and hello, everyone. Very nice to be here with you all, and nice to talk about environmental law reform, one of my favourite topics. We won't speak for too long, Emily and I guess what we've been asked to come and touch on is why do we think this is important for financial institutions like that we work with, and what we're kind of hearing from some of those financial institutions about how this might play out. As it says also on the slide, the question is really as well, how can financial institutions navigate this reform process if and when they should kind of participate in it, and why does it matter, essentially? So I'm just going to talk for a couple of minutes about, I guess, that first question, and then Em is going to round us out. So if we just jump onto the next slide, Em, to pick up on a couple of things that Brendan said, that the EPBC Act is I guess the way that I think of it is it's the legislation that allows companies or organisations to impact the environment, and particularly matters of national environmental significance. That's what it is. If we think of it as more than that at the moment, then we are going down a pathway that is somewhat misguided. So I wanted to start by reiterating that point from Brendan, because it's really, really important. The EPBC Act is one pillar of a whole suite of very, very complex and interconnected environmental laws in in this country. And they are very, very complex, and it's worth noting that as financial institutions, because the way that they interplay, particularly between state and federal regulators, is really, really challenging for financial institutions who are trying to understand nature, risk and opportunity within their value chains, which I think is actually going to be the biggest driver of financial institutions seeking to interact with the EPBC Act reforms and hopefully to influence them in some way. Because the EPBC Act is that kind of flagship Commonwealth legislation, it is often the starting point of the due diligence process that financial institutions go through, either from a lending perspective or project financing perspective, or from an investment perspective. So I often see, in banking due diligence processes, a question of, is this an activity or a client that is likely to impact upon a matter of national environmental significance? Have they, gone through the process of the EPBC Act approvals, and what does that look like? So if this is the kind of starting point or the stopgap from which financial institutions set out in their environmental due diligence process in financing, making sure that it is doing what it says on the tin is really important. So is it actually providing that level of control or comfort over impacts on nature where that is nationally significant nature? And as Brendan has already said far better than I could, it hasn't been doing that necessarily in the past. And a lot of that is down to essentially the structure of the legislation and the dependence upon the decision-making instrument, which is the minister. So how that kind of plays out in the future is going to be really, really interesting. But what I guess I would really encourage financial institutions to be thinking about throughout this reform process is, how is the EPBC Act reform going to influence other regulatory instruments upon which you are relying to mitigate risks of adverse impacts on nature? Because whether you are pursuing, a TNFD aligned disclosure, whether you have a sustainability strategy that's identified deforestation risk as one of your material topics, whether you are trying to integrate your climate and nature strategies going forward, understanding the level of mitigation that regulation provides to you is going to be really critical to that. So getting this right actually is really, really important. That said, though, it is not going to provide you with that holistic level of control. So you need to be thinking about how it is interacting with some of those other instruments in order to do that. What we also know is that it's not necessarily going to tick off on some of these other issues that you might be looking to regulation to manage. So things like disruptions within supply chains that can result in material financial risks, also productivity impacts, regulatory restrictions and litigation, so market access issues, for example, overseas, damage to reputation and or social license, and also the kind of broader economic collapse that can come with a significant or systemic degradation of nature upon which our economy is so dependent. I don't think, and I'm interested, Megan, Brendan, feel free to disagree with me, I don't think that the EPBC Act on its own is going to provide a level of control or comfort for any of these risks to business, essentially. It controls certain parts of those risks, but not all of them. So I guess the point then, or the kind of ask of financial institutions as you observe and participate in this reform process, is to be thinking about how the EPBC Act is going to interact with some of those other regulatory regimes, to think about, Nicole framed this really well at the beginning, and Brendan also mentioned it around, the lack of appropriate integration of consultation with respect for Indigenous people's rights in this country is a massive gap that needs to be solved. It's not necessarily going to be solved by this single instrument. So that kind of connection between nature, people, and the economy is really, really critical going forward. And while the EPBC Act is going to be an important pillar of that process, it is not going to be enough in and of itself. That said, and as Brendan touched on in his final slide there, the objective here is a comprehensive reform agenda, of which the EPBC Act is one pillar. So getting this right is very, very important. It is the strongest kind of instrument that we have at that Commonwealth level, but in reality, much of the regulatory control over environmental impacts is being done by the states. So I would also just encourage each of the financial institutions to be aware of engaging with and understanding how the state regulation is, affecting or not affecting that level of control over adverse impacts on the environment. I'll hand over to you, Em. Thank you.
Thanks, Alex. All right. So I'd like to speak a little bit more about how the finance sector engages with the EPBC Act and what we've seen across our engagements around that relationship between financial sector operations within their direct operations and their value chain, and how that interacts with the EPBC Act. So, and then building upon that, to echo sort of what Alex was saying around the fit for purpose nature of the EPBC Act and the importance of going beyond compliance to make sure that we're really driving outcomes that are aligned with the global biodiversity framework and the federal government's broader environmental goals, and then also just touching on the importance of engagement and advocacy and the role of the financial sector. So I will take you through that now. And just to reflect, I guess, in preparation for this call, I was thinking about how I've supported clients over the past year or so, including in helping to frame the sustainable finance taxonomy. There have been a lot of discussions on how the financial sector interacts with environmental laws. And so on the screen there, I've got a reference to environmental due diligence processes, and I've seen companies, financial institutions do this well. I mean, at a baseline, there is that need in due diligence to look at compliance with environmental laws. As we've discussed, there are issues with that if the laws aren't actually achieving the right outcomes that you need to get. Then look, the compliance mechanism will only ever get you to that compliance baseline rather than actually protecting, conserving, or enhancing nature. So that's, I guess, a first point on when we're thinking about these environmental laws. I think Nicole mentioned it right at the start. How do we actually lift that baseline in our environmental laws so that that baseline due diligence process that financial institutions will look at when they're looking to lend or invest will actually provide more protection for, at least for matters of national environmental significance that are regulated under the EPBC Act. So that's my first thought. Then on the next point around product design, and I guess looking at the sustainable finance taxonomy, do no significant harm criteria is certainly an area that the interaction with environmental laws came through. So again, it's that sort of compliance baseline with applying a sustainable finance taxonomy criteria that you needed to ensure no significant harm has occurred. And under approaches taken by the EU taxonomy, for example, there's quite detailed criteria around that are one option is to make that align to environmental laws. So we can see probably that this will happen more in the future, that we will have criteria in sort of certain product designs and requirements to then establish your compliance with environmental law as well. So that's sort of another example of how it might come through in more innovative products that we see for sustainability over time, again, to lift that baseline. I also just wanted to touch on the specifics of the Nature Positive Plan, just reflecting on that. There are a few items just worth calling out, definitely worth having a read of this document if you haven't. As Brendan mentioned, there's the National Environmental Standards, which will help drive better outcomes across, again, the matters of national environmental significance that are regulated. But other things to note probably is the focus on environmental information and data. So this has come through a lot in my discussions with financial institutions around how do you get the right information and sort of wanting to work together with the financial institution to collaborate and get better insights on information, but then having sort of competition barriers as well. So how to navigate that to help lift different industries as well across the financial sector, but how to best work together. So I think the Environmental Information Agency that the Nature Positive Plan commits to will support greater sharing of information, which will hopefully be of benefit to financial institutions. And in particular, I know there's a lot of work happening in the insurance sector to share like natural hazard modelling with that agency so that there can be better information shared. So that will definitely be increasingly part of financial institutions' interactions with environmental laws as they undertake these processes within their operations. Probably the other thing is the Environmental Protection Agency that they're looking to establish at a federal level under these reforms. So there are such agencies across a number of states, and so you may have had interactions at a state level for state environmental laws, which regulate different sort of matters of under the state priorities rather than these matters of national environmental significance. So there is proposed introduction of an independent environmental protection agency, which will provide sort of more of a compliance lens over the activities of businesses and companies that you finance. So it's just another, I guess, regulatory or compliance check that we'll see more commonly through businesses, that there is that increasing pressure to ensure good practices, and that there will be sort of a independent, depoliticized regulator at the federal level for environmental performance. So that's just something else worth pointing out. And also there's the nature repair market, and I'll leave that with Megan to talk to in more detail, but just to note that the intention of that reform is to, which has now been established in separate legislation, so it has been passed through Parliament, is to develop a framework by which landholders can issue biodiversity certificates for improvements in biodiversity on land. So that is, in theory, another sort of income stream that you might see through the businesses that you lend to and invest in. That all said, as we've been discussing, environmental compliance is unlikely to be enough to really achieve the outcomes that we've set under the Global Biodiversity Framework to, for example, protect 30% of land, waters and oceans, I think it is, by 2030. So there's some really strong ambition from international frameworks and the government to protect, restore and enhance nature. And so there really is this increasing pressure from a policy perspective, in addition to the EPBC Act regulation, to go above and beyond that baseline compliance. And there will increasingly be a need for financial institutions to do that, in addition to sort of complying with laws. So, for example, the Task Force for Nature-related Financial Disclosures, and I know that a lot of ASFI's members are early adopters, and so that is going to be a really important policy lever that companies can engage with to provide better management of nature risks and opportunities. So Alex and I were talking about this presentation and what to touch on, and Alex's comment to me was that she often hears from government that the financial sector doesn't engage as much, and so they're not sure as much sometimes what the views are, and we have groups like ASFI who definitely do a great job being that conduit and information flow for the financial institutions. But I think hopefully this has been a helpful overview of some areas that you are engaging already with environmental laws and the benefits of what you might see through these reforms. But there's really an opportunity for financial sector participants at the moment to engage with the government on these reforms to kind of ensure that they're fit for purpose for financial institutions and will give you the best outcomes within sort of the remit of the EPBC Act function. So I guess that's a bit of a shout out for ambition, and I'm sure ASFI is on board to support with that. But yeah, I just wanted to comment that that's a real area we see that would be valuable.
And just before we hand over to Megan, that the other point on that, government saying, can we hear more about what the financial industry actually wants and needs from a regulatory perspective? We also hear the inverse from our clients in the finance sector who say, why isn't the government regulating this better? Is it really up to us to come and work this out ourselves? So which I'm like, that's so perfect. You both want to, be doing this together. So I just, I hear that quite a lot from financial institutions. It would be so much easier if the government just effectively regulated, environmental risk and impact, and then we don't have to kind of do it on a client by client basis. So the government, it can probably be very open to having those kinds of conversations with you, and I'd encourage you to do that too.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Emily and Alex. And I think while Megan is going to start sharing her screen, I was actually going to touch on that point, and you might have already answered it, but I will ask it anyway. Alex, just from your guys' perspective and the perspectives of your clients and the financial institutions as businesses that you work with, I guess, the perceived consequences of having baseline regulation that is quite far removed from global market expectations, and where that puts these businesses and financial institutions, so the burden that it places on them.
Yeah, it's a great question, Nicole, because we are a net exporter, and we have a very significant dependency within our economy on nature. So what is happening now already, and what will continue to happen, is this. I kind of think of this as the how we see ourselves versus how the rest of the world sees us, and that is starting to manifest through basically market access challenges and access to finance challenges. So there is still a significant amount of offshore financing coming into high impact sectors in Australia, and we did some work with the Wilderness Society looking at that specifically from a deforestation risk perspective, but you can and and Co have done some work with the Conservation Foundation around that for other banking. So we know that offshore financing is coming in, and that is going to be more and more challenging in the future as that offshore financing increases their expectations around environmental performance. And similarly, the Australian, primary producers, be that the miners, the agricultural companies, the forestry companies, and so on, who are exporting to different markets, are going to be asked increasingly for information about environmental performance, and simply saying, oh, well, we have complied with the EPBC Act to be told that we're allowed to impact the environment in this way as long as we pay X amount to a restoration fund, or have gone through the mitigation hierarchy and bought an offset. It may not meet those market expectations going forward. And particularly, Europe is the big one, obviously. So we don't export everything to Europe. And so it is going to apply pressure on certain parts of the Australian market. And for financial institutions who do have exposure in their books to exporters to Europe, that's probably where if you were going to ask me what to do, that's where you should be starting to have these conversations about, do we need to be going above and beyond to be able to help the clients to have the data that they're going to need to provide to those lenders or to those customers in Europe going forward. And that's only going to increase. Obviously, there's a massive focus on decarbonisation right now. So how able is the Australian industry to provide information about meaningful decarbonisation pathways into other markets? But it's coming for the others. In fact, in Europe, it is already there, and we're seeing that. So yeah, I think it's a really important point that there is a level of exposure and risk within the financial books in Australia that is being driven by offshore markets. So it doesn't necessarily matter so much what happens here. It's about the credentials that companies are able to provide about their own management of environmental impact beyond regulation.
Yeah, no, for sure. Thanks, Alex. All right, we're going to hand over to Megan, who's going to go a little bit deeper into the weeds and I think touch on more on some of these risk issues. So over to you. Thanks, Megan.
Thanks, Nicole. Hope you can all hear and see my slides okay. Yeah, so yes, I'm going to go into some of the weeds, but the purpose of going into the weeds is to try to actually figure out what this piece of legislation is actually going to deliver. So one of the Samuel recommendations was it needs, this new reform, whatever law reform needs to happen for EPBC, is that it needs to actually incentivise and measure and evaluate environmental outcomes. Because what are we doing if we don't actually know what a piece of legislation is delivering? So one of the key concerns was that EPBC was heavily process driven. We don't really monitor or track or incentivise outcomes. So this is part of the reason why we've got this kind of nature positive branding, but I do want to demystify that a bit for a range of reasons. So what Asfi and Nicole and others pitched me was really just to try to understand or to explain how this law reform is going to set the rules and incentives for private investment, particularly related to things we used to call offsets, I'm going to continue calling them offsets just because. So 3 main points that I want to talk through today. What does nature positive mean in the context of law reform? What are some of the changes to offset policy and requirements? The main one is we've rebranded them. Take that, the implications of that what you will. And what are the implications for investment and risk exposure? So we hear this term nature positive a lot, and I hear a couple of things generally. One is that, well, we don't really know what this means. And then the other one is, well, how do we operationalise this idea? And they're two very different questions. And I totally empathise with the concern or uncertainty about how to operationalise nature positive, because, yeah, it's bloody hard. But if you don't know what it means, you can literally just Google or go to naturepositive.org, and there's actually a very clear and specific definition on there. It's very short, and yeah, it's very broad. But there are some really important components of that quite short definition. One is that it specified a baseline of 2020 from which nature loss needs to be halted and reversed. So if you look at that graph, you know, that is the baseline or the benchmark from which we expect to start bending that curve of biodiversity loss. And, you know, then we're seeking to increase, you know, then we've got a range of different metrics or indicators: health, abundance, diversity, resilience of species, populations, ecosystems. All of these things could potentially be measured. Nature and biodiversity is, unfortunately, or fortunately for us being alive, diverse. We can't have a single metric for nature. So that by 2030, nature is visibly and measurably on the path of recovery. So even though it's very short and fairly simple, it's actually quite clear and specific. It's a smart target. So we can actually start operationalising from that fairly simple definition. How has the Australian government interpreted the term? Pretty vague, to be honest. The Nature Positive plan from end of 2022, you'll notice that the years have been removed. Nature positive is a term that's used to describe circumstances where nature is being repaired by who and is regenerating spontaneously rather than being in decline. Okay, that could literally be anywhere at any point in any circumstance. There's no accountability, there's no scope to evaluate and monitor progress. So that's not super useful. They expanded upon that about 6 months later, saying, well, this is actually a collective outcome. Again, kind of, you know, spreading out accountability, which is, again, super useful. As of February 2024, there is no definition. In the last lockup in February, which I'm not invited to the lockups as me as an academic. I'm only being smuggled in by an environmental NGO because academic experts aren't invited. The objects of the draft bill of the actual, you know, primary piece of legislation, where the primary object is to contribute to a quote unquote nature positive Australia. There's still no definition about what nature positive Australia means, and there's this real little subscript at the end saying, well, this will be defined in the provisions to establish the statutory head of Environmental Information Australia. It's bizarre. So essentially, we still have kind of ambiguity about what is this outcome that this piece of legislation is aiming to deliver. But you can figure it out through some detective work. Now, I don't want you to read this slide. I'm going to illustrate what it all means in the following slides, but this is just a taste of some of the stuff that is in this big package. You can try to figure out what is the actual outcome of the legislation through various definitions, particularly related to offsets / restoration actions. Things like baseline is also helpfully, that is genuinely helpfully defined. Skipping through, but also just to highlight here that the definition for a restoration action: deliver a projected gain for the protected matter, so threatened species, ecosystem, whatever, of at least X% relative to a baseline. It's still X%, okay? So the X% is still TBD. And so we don't, yeah, that's still a policy decision and potentially an opportunity for, you know, interested parties to try to make some recommendations, suggestions about what that X should be. So here's my illustration of what is nature positive, and I'm going to illustrate that according to our existing law and this proposed future law. Now, I don't think we can disagree that we've got an existing trend of biodiversity loss. We can quibble about the relative slope of that line, but generally speaking, we've got biodiversity loss. At the moment, the EPBC Act, not explicitly through the Act, but rather through its existing environmental offsets policy, which is a policy, it's not enshrined in legislation. But by, when we have an assessment and approval process and we've avoided, mitigated all reasonable impacts, we have a residual remaining impact on some threatened species habitat, then the regulator will say, okay, look, we will approve that loss of habitat, but you need to deliver an offset, and that offset must improve or maintain the viability of the protected matter as compared to what is likely to have occurred under the status quo. What that basically means, or what that does mean, is that the offset, if it works perfectly, is in effect maintaining existing trends, maintaining status quo. And this, I've been telling this story for nearly 15 years now, and it is still surprising to most people when they hear it. But this is the thing, no net loss or offsets in general, if they work perfectly, which we know they don't, at best maintains the status quo. Okay? Now, obviously, we know the status quo isn't sufficient. What's this net positive or net gain X% stuff that's been highlighted in the new package? Well, because we don't know what the X is, and because the definition of baseline in the previous slides is that we're still, again, going against a baseline of status quo, net positive is essentially improving that trend a bit. Exactly the extent to which that trend is improved is going to be open for whatever the X is. Okay, so that's good, but as you can see, we're still kind of not really in a great situation. Now, I will say that an improvement in the existing draft bill is that the circumstances in which using an offset or protecting existing habitat in exchange for a loss of habitat is going to be severely restricted, because what happens when you protect something that's already there that was never going to be cleared in the first place in exchange for a loss, that can actually worsen biodiversity decline, particularly if there's gaming or exaggeration. Any economists in the room will know about adverse selection. That is rife in biodiversity offsets. So thankfully, we've actually kind of been in a situation, because most offsets up until now, and it's something that Samuel explicitly called out, this use of avoided loss or reverted loss offsets needs to be removed. They're not completely removing it, but they are restricting it. Now, the green line is nature positive. Now, as you can see, I've kind of, we can quibble about the slope, but we're measurably on the path of recovery by 2030. Maybe it's a bit less steep. But nature positive, even though it's an explicitly defined under the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, being very simple, it means more nature in the future than we have now. So we actually need to increase nature. So that's actually an absolute net gain. See how there's a difference between a relative net gain, which is the purple, and an absolute net gain. An absolute net gain is we're actually literally getting more. A relative net gain is we're getting more relative to whatever we're comparing to, which most of the time is status quo, which is decline. Now, so the existing package is committing to the purple, not the green. Okay? Which means that wherever these, purple and green lines end up, we are, even with this existing, reform package, there is still going to be a massive shortfall between being compliant with quote unquote nature positive laws and actual nature positive. So there just becomes a question of who's going to pay. If the person if no one is specified, it's going to be the public and all of us. So then it becomes a policy question about who should be paying, either through public investment or, beyond compliance action, etc. And so, the lower that X is and the weaker the, regulatory reforms are, the harder it's going to become to get to nature positive. Now, we might then, and I'm not going to talk explicitly about nature repair market, but I will say that, look, environmental markets, biodiversity credits, nature credits, certificates, whatever, can have a role to play. In my view, they're massively overstated in terms of their potential. But importantly, to get to nature positive, we need much more additional nature and biodiversity being conserved that is not in exchange for a loss. So if you purchase biodiversity or nature certificates, credits in a way whereby you are either explicitly using it as compensation, implicitly using it as compensation, storing them up, buying them as voluntary measures now, and then waiting until TNFD becomes mandatory and then saying, oh, look at all this stuff that we bought beforehand that's got to mitigate our exposure. It's still being used as compensation in some way. So yes, these certificates, credits, widgets, whatever, can help to get to nature positive, but only if they're retired and not used, because we're actually having to make up for a massive debt that's, a historical debt. If you're using it to address a future or current risk exposure loss, it's actually going to keep you in the red, keep all of us in the red. So the key change, there's a couple of key changes, a lot of key changes, but the key changes that I'll highlight around offsets is that we're using different names. We've got the X% as mentioned before. A couple of good things, the mitigation hierarchy, so the requirement to avoid, mitigate, do all those things before going to offsets is going to be enshrined in primary legislation rather than just a policy that no one cares about. So that's really good. The other thing is that offsets / restoration actions must be demonstrably commenced prior to the impact occurring. That is hugely important because, as my work has shown and that of others, is that most of the time impacts get approved and then the offset details are figured out later. They end up getting delayed by years or forgotten about, and there's no legal compliance hook to actually deal with it. It's a massive, massive, massive issue. Unfortunately, these positive things have been kind of undercut by what I consider to be a really bad development in this space, which is you don't even need to do offsets anymore. You can just pay and go. This isn't a situation that was flagged in the Nature Positive plan where, look, you do need to offset or find restoration actions or whatever, but if you can't, in those circumstances, you could pay. No, it's actually been made more loose by saying proponents can choose to compensate 100% of their significant or residual significant impacts entirely through restoration contributions, which is a payment. And importantly, these payments do not need to deliver like for like. What do I mean by like for like? It means that if I clear Regent Honeyeater habitat and I pay and go, that payment does not need to benefit Regent Honeyeater. it could benefit, I don't know, legless lizard or some other ecosystem that is probably less threatened. And so that has been framed as a better overall situation. In my view, that is going to lead to the loss of diversity because you're approving impacts to some species and not compensating them. Also worth highlighting that the whole pay and go approach is not doing super well in New South Wales. This happened right at the end of last year. Independent Pricing and Regulatory Tribunal made the recommendation that the Biodiversity Conservation Fund in New South Wales phase out the pay and go option because developers were paying. Oh, we've got all this money that we can't spend because we can't find offsets. Same things happen in Queensland and the Pilbara as well. So, and before I say something a bit more positive, look, honestly, this better overall statement, in my view, is a euphemism for extinction, because if you're impacting on a swift parrot or a regent honeyeater or a migratory marine species, a Commonwealth marine area or an endangered ecological community, you don't actually need to compensate for those impacts. And there's no real information anywhere about how that is going to be addressed or how that is compatible with the apparent pledge to have zero new extinctions. It's a policy regression, in my view. Now, I think there are some circumstances where a pay and go option is reasonable. Okay. Through my work interviewing assessment officers, dealing with this regulation, there are some proponents, types of proponents, real estate is one that came up a lot, who just are really risky. They don't know anything about the EPBC Act. It's a pain in the butt to try to regulate them. They, change their name, they close down. You can't actually chase them for compliance. In some cases, with limited scope, I think pay and go is reasonable. I just don't think it should be the option that everyone is going to use. You can choose. I think most proponents will choose 100% to use the restoration options or restoration contributions. I think you'll find that the big guys, so, the Rios, the BHPs, etc., who have in-house expertise and they've got land, they will probably still choose to acquit some of their offset requirements through actual offsets, which then, they'll be better able to track their nature-related risks, which is interesting and will make some ESG scores interesting for them. So I guess just reiterating, and I'll finish momentarily, reiterating what Nicole and others have said, look, ultimately, like this regulation, it's not a market creation bill like the nature repair. It's about, stopping bad stuff before it happens. And the stronger the regulation, the more incentive we have to actually protect nature. So, yeah, how big do we want that shortfall, essentially? I'm not going to tell financial institutions how to finance or invest, but there is some scope for investment or private investment that is compatible with nature positive, but it depends. Depends what do you want out of it. Do you want commercial returns or do you want a good news story? It depends on the type of critter or nature that you're thinking about. Things that are slow, uncertain, unpredictable, and you can't find them are not especially compatible with private investment that is seeking a commercial return. Now, you could potentially invest in tokens or credits or whatever, but if you either intend to or indirectly use it in some way as compensation, then it's no longer contributing to nature positive. It's actually just compensating for a loss. So, yeah, just kind of highlighting what I mentioned there. The scope for private investment into true conservation that delivers a financial return is kind of very, very, very slim. Finally, look, the use of the pay and go option will acquit proponents of liability. You know, that they're no longer liable for the dealing with those losses. But I think it's going to make it more difficult for retail banks, super funds, etc., to have a line of sight to those nature-related risks, because you're not going to be able to track anything. And I'm really interested to know whether, nature positive claims are going to start to be scrutinised by financial regulators. I think the Australian government is probably going to be, well, I would argue they should be #1 on the list in terms of misusing, misleading or false claims related to nature positive, because, and in some of my recommendations, I've said change the name of the bill, because you're just lying at the moment. Like, it's not going to be a nature positive piece of legislation. You can't use nature positive as an adjective. It doesn't math. Happy to discuss further, but I'll finish up now.
Thanks, Megan. Very sobering, but I think absolutely, what we need to hear. I think part of this workshop is really to give people an understanding of what the real issues are. I think to Megan's point about the definition of nature positive, yes, it does exist, and yes, it can be measured, but used in the wrong way, similar to many other sustainability claims. And I know that this is at the forefront of financial institutions' minds in terms of really being able to demonstrate and act on this, and how do we do that under this environment. So I might hand back to Brendan, who's going to be talking on behalf of Brendan now. Please do put your Q&A in the chat if you've got. We do have some time for Q&A afterwards, but Brendan is really just going to close us off on this series of presentations, and then we can open up for Q&A. So thank you, Brendan.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, Brendan.
Great. Yeah, thanks. Yes, so back as me now. Thank you to Alex and Emily and Megan for those thought-provoking presentations. I just wanted to conclude with a few points that I think might be of interest to people here, certainly of interest to us, and then I understand we'll have some time for questions and discussions. 3 points, really. One is one of the really important things that we're talking about here in terms of moving away from the process-oriented system that we have now to actually protecting things, what that actually means and what it's looking like in practice. Institutional reform and the new EPA and Environment Information Australia, which has already been touched on, but I'll talk a little bit about that as well. And I wanted to conclude with some reflections on something that has come up a little bit in the discussion so far around what this looks like in a federal system and where we're at or where we're heading in terms of an effective national system of environmental protection. So yes, I'll just quickly cover those 3 points. So laws that actually protect nature. I mean, I think one way to understand the analysis that what we have at the moment is a very process-oriented system is that it really seeks to achieve environmental outcomes by friction, by tying people up in processes, by adding expense to getting necessary approvals and so forth, by putting obstacles in people's paths in terms of the difficulty and expense of obtaining offsets. And what's being proposed here, which turns out is actually quite difficult to achieve in practice, but what's being proposed is to move to something that's far clearer around the outcomes that we're wanting to achieve through the system, and in particular, a far more specific conceptualisation and implementation of things that are intended to be unacceptable from the outset, things that are where impacts on them are not to be permitted under the system. That's quite revolutionary, quite different to the way that the system works at the moment, where everything basically comes into the funnel and then there's some sort of environmental impact assessment process, and there's very little hard boundaries or hard edges to what can ultimately be approved under the system. So as I said, this is I think a really important element of the reform. It's a commitment the government has been sort of clear on in terms of what's their response to the Samuel Review, and I've extracted there some language from the Minister explaining what she means by red lines from a presentation she made to the National Environmental Law Association conference late last year. The challenge, I guess, that we're experiencing at the moment is that although the commitment is there and there's a recognition that this is something that's required to have anything that can be credibly called nature positive, that implements our commitments under the Global Biodiversity Framework. Actually implementing this in practice is very difficult, and designing a regulatory system that achieves these sorts of upfront protections is very difficult in practice, both from a design perspective, but also obviously politically controversial as well, given that that effectively means a no, an early no for a lot of things that might currently sail on through the system. So I think this is definitely an issue to watch. It's something that I think is critically important if we're actually to start turning things around and to really, I guess, meet the key element of nature positive, which is about halting nature destruction. Reversing the decline is really important as well, and bending the curve up. But a critical foundational thing to that is actually halting current destruction. So yeah, definitely, I think a really important component of the package, one that is in a pretty problematic position at the moment, has got a way to go to get to a point where we're really delivering on what's being promised. I wanted to talk briefly about the institutions, and Emily touched on the EPA briefly as well. I think Environment Information Australia. We wouldn't want to be heard to be saying that institutional reform per se is going to change the world, but it is a pretty important part of the package, and together with the new rules that are being proposed, standards and so forth, I think new institutions could be a game changer. Environment Protection Australia is intended to be a new statutory agency that basically assumes the current decision-making functions that are the responsibility of the Minister and the Department in terms of approvals, but also has responsibility for compliance and enforcement. And importantly too, for oversight of accredited arrangements. The key example here is that things like regional forest agreements are really managed in a set and forget sort of way at the moment. State systems are effectively accredited for meeting our objectives under national environmental laws, but nothing is done to actually ensure that they deliver that outcome in practice. And the proposal here is that the EPA would have oversight of those accredited arrangements. I think particularly the compliance and enforcement functions are potentially a real game changer, and a very specific example of that is in the context of agricultural clearing and deforestation in an agricultural context. There is, I think, fairly clearly a de facto exemption, really a political settlement that was achieved some time ago that says that, well, we won't apply our national environmental laws in that context. And I wouldn't say that an EPA and the institutional reforms that proposed would inevitably change that, but it just becomes far harder, I think, to actually administer environmental laws in that sort of way if you've got an independent agency that's in charge and intends to take a systematic and approach to how it goes about its compliance and enforcement functions. Environment Information Australia as well, I'd encourage you to go and have a look at the detail on that, and I've included a link on this slide to the policy papers from December, which includes quite a bit of detail on what's proposed. That'll be a statutory office, a person within the department, basically the head of Environment Information Australia, and I've listed some of the key functions there, collecting and coordinating data, but also in a way that, as Megan has pointed out, as yet unexplained, having some sort of responsibility for what nature positive actually means. So we're very keen to see the detail of that. But also state of the environment reporting, publication of environmental accounts and so forth. So this is not something that's received a lot of attention, but I think it's really well worth having a closer look at the idea of this new Environment Information Australia and its functions, and how it might contribute to a more effective national system of environmental protection. The final issue I wanted to touch on was this one of how these reforms sort of fit within the kind of overall arc of the development of an effective national system within our federal system of government of environmental protection. This is a problematic issue, I guess, in the sense that we environmentalists have always been concerned that the federal government doesn't take its responsibility seriously when it comes to environmental protection, and doesn't use all the powers that it has available to it in terms of under the Constitution, in terms of actually picking up the cudgels on environmental regulation. I think this is what happens in the field of environment is quite a contrast to other social and economic issues at a national level, say occupational health and safety and employment law, corporations law, family law and so forth, where it's very well recognised that the Commonwealth has a key leadership role. far more complicated position when it comes to the environment, and a really messy and complicated division of labour between the states and the Commonwealth. The book that I've got a photo of the cover of here is by Philip Toyne, a former director of ACF. It dates back from the early 90s and really expressed his disappointment that following the Tasmanian Dams case in the 80s, the Commonwealth really didn't step up to using the full range of constitutional powers it had available to it, and was really beaten back into some sort of submission by the states, I guess, in the early 90s. And the EPBC Act was ultimately a culmination of that very unsatisfactory compromise. I think the key point here is that there are some elements, maybe Environment Information Australia, some of the other reforms that we've been talking about, the National Environmental Standards, that are somewhat of a step change towards sort of greater Commonwealth leadership on the environment, but we're still very much following the Samuel Review and in the frame of the Nature Positive Plan, sort of stuck in the framework of state and federal responsibilities as they were sort of articulated in the early 1990s. And that it's quite a contrast, I guess, with recent developments in climate, where there's been a very significant stepping up of the Commonwealth government to leadership in the area. I've raised this issue because I think it's very important to anyone, like people here, I imagine, who sort of operate at a national level and really don't think of Australia as sort of 7 or 8 separate countries, but we're still very much, it seems, stuck in that mould when it comes to our environmental laws. And I think while they're being developed over the course of the next 6 months and pass through Parliament, it'd be really worth thinking about, you know, where are the other changes that could be made that would assure us that the Commonwealth is actually going to step up to a far more effective national leadership and coordination role than is currently envisaged. Thank you. I'll leave it there.